Hello, friends. Welcome back. This is December 7th, and it's our seventh story in the series, and this is about a man named Dan Cranert. Now, Dan was born with a degenerative heart condition right around 1962, and that condition was no sooner diagnosed as a baby than it went into remission, completely unexplained. That, of course, was incredibly good news. He was able to live a normal life through elementary school and middle school. His freshman and sophomore years of high school was filled with friends and fun, and especially baseball. He loved baseball. But come junior year, a problem arose. Just as he had inexplicably went into remission as a baby, inexplicably the condition reasserted itself, and Dan began to go into heart failure. And with the consultation of the doctors said the only solution for this is a full heart transplant. And that, of course, is overwhelming in so many different ways, especially in 1980. Financially, it wasn't possible for most people. The surgery is very difficult. The recovery is very difficult. And all of that, of course, is subject to the availability of a heart. So news that he needed a heart transplant was more than discouraging. It seemed like an impossibility. But one by one, though, those barriers to him having a replacement heart seemed to come down. Dan's doctor was able to get him into Stanford's transplant program, which was a feat unto itself. Dan's hometown of Napa, California, started doing fundraisers for him. There was bake sales, there were projects, and strangers, family, everyone donated. So finally, some of those financial barriers came down. Many strangers donated blood on Dan's behalf for not just Dan, but patients like him as well. And so some of these barriers to it become for him getting a heart transplant had finally come down. And so, but at Christmas time, when Dan was 18, his time was running out. His heart was getting bad. He'd been living for months with his parents on what's called Life Row. It's a group of apartments by the Stanford Medical Complex, and just kind of waiting for a heart to become available. And that wait ended on December 22nd, but not in the way that they had wanted. When Dr. Walworth called, he called Dan, and he advised him, why don't you go home to Napa for Christmas? And Dan and his parents knew what that meant. It was, in some ways, giving up. The doctor wanted Dan's last Christmas to be at home. No heart was to be had. But Dan put on a brave face after the call. He didn't want to discourage his parents. And so he drummed up all the excitement he could. He's saying, I get to go home for Christmas, and we're supposed to go home. And Dan's parents, they did the same for Dan. They didn't want to discourage him. And so they put on a brave face, even though all three of them knew what it meant. So Dan's mom calls his grandma in Napa to tell her that they are coming home for Christmas, and the family's going to try to make it, of course, the best Christmas ever, for obvious reasons, because they anticipate it will be Dan's last one. So they get into the car, and they begin the hour-and-a-half drive home from Palo Alto to Napa on the 101 freeway. It's a beautiful drive, and Dan had been cooped up for a long time in these apartments. He had to keep away from anything that might get any kind of infection. So he was really grateful to get out. But even as he's in the back of the car riding and looking out the window at the trees and the coastline, he can feel his heart just pounding wildly. It is completely worn out, and it's not going to sustain him for much longer. And so he knows his time is going to be very short. And so and that discouraged him, and he thought, it seems kind of pointless to be celebrating Christmas. But he also knew that was not a healthy mentality to have. And so he did what he sometimes did to fight that. He literally started counting his blessings, all of the good things that had happened to him in his life and through this medical journey that he was coming to the end of. And he was still doing that when the car pulled into his grandmother's driveway, and he was excited to be home. But all of a sudden, Dan's grandmother runs out of the house, and she's screaming at them. And she's screaming at them because a heart had become available. So there's a rapid conference through the window of the car, and Dan's grandma is saying, "You got to go back because it's the heart is going to be only viable until 4:30. It was already 3:30, and so Dan's dad, of course, struck with despair for a moment, but grandma's on top of things. She said, "I've booked a private plane. You got to get to the airport right now." So they're about to back up and just streamline from the airport, and the backstory of this is that as they had been going up on the 101, people had been trying to find them. This was before the days of cell phones. So it was put out to the radio, on the radio stations, hey, if anybody sees the car matching the description that Dan was in, let them know that, hey, this heart has become available. The California Highway Patrol, CHP, you can think of them as kind of like the police officers of the road. They were looking for them. And so it had become well known. The only one who didn't seem to know was Dan and his parents. So they're about to back out of this driveway and just try to fly to the airport to get Dan to this plane. But as soon as they do, another car comes flying in. It's the CHP. It's the California Highway Patrol. And the officer just opens the vehicle and just bellows out, "Get in, we're going to get you to the airport." And you can get there a lot faster in a police vehicle with sirens. And so that they hop in, and he gets them to the airport. They get on a Cessna. They take the quick flight from Napa to Palo Alto. As soon as they land in Palo Alto, there's an ambulance on the runway, and they get into that, and Dan is put into Stanford Medical Center 4 minutes, with 4 minutes to spare of when he had to be there in order for this operation to take place. And so as Dan's in the prep room he's getting an IV of anti-rejection medication, he hears the local radio station because, it was put out there. Everybody tried to find this vehicle because of a heart transplant. And now people want to know, they want to keep updated on what's going on. And so the DJs, the announcers, the people on the radio, they were keeping people appraised. And so he's got this IV in his arm, and he's about to go to surgery, and Dan hears a newscaster asking the listeners of Southern California to have a moment of prayer for Dan because the surgery is about to begin. Right? And that got him. That was an emotional moment. Dan's parents come in, say their goodbyes before the surgery. Dan's dad says, "I wish I could do anything to trade places with you." Dan's mom, they have an exchange, and Dan handed a card that he had kept on him in case this moment ever happened. And it bore a quote from Ezekiel 36:26, saying this, "I will give you a new heart and put a new spirit in you." And the surgery took place. The next 2 days were complicated, as anyone who's been through a major surgery like that can tell you. Dan was disoriented through the most of those first 2 days of recovery, a blurry and groggy existence. But on the third day, Dan was cogent, and he could be propped up in bed. He was in a lot of pain, but it was a different pain. It wasn't the pain of heart failure. It was incision and all of the things that had been done. And so in the first time in 2 years, he could not feel his heart overworking. His parents were allowed to come in, gowned up and all of the equipment to keep in any kind of infection from getting to Dan as a precaution. And Dan's mom looks at him, comes in and says, "Merry Christmas." And it took Dan off guard because, it's very easy to lose track of dates in a hospital situation like that. But it grabbed him because he reflected for a moment how pointless celebrating Christmas had seemed just a few days earlier when he was trying to count his blessings as he's pulling into that driveway. And now things, of course, were completely different. Dan's parents, they talk with him a little bit, and then someone brings in this huge pile of mail. And what had happened is all the radio listeners had sent Christmas cards, had sent cards of well wishes to Dan. And so they're opening them up one by one. There's just this huge stack of them. But the most touching one was from Paul and Barbara Chambers. And it said this: Dear Dan, even though we do not know you, my husband and I feel so close to your family. Our only son, Lloyd, was your donor. Knowing that you have his heart has made our loss so much easier to bear. With all our love, Paul and Barbara. Dan later wrote this of that moment. He said, I couldn't fight the tears any longer. And suddenly I knew more clearly than ever the real reason why I should be celebrating Christmas. In dying, the Chambers' only son had given me life. And in dying, God's only son had given us life, eternal life. Grace and peace to you, my friends. And don't forget the important things this season. Take care.